Welcome to Then and Now, a podcast by the UCLA Luskin Center for History and Policy. We study change in order to make change, linking knowledge of the past to the quest for a better future. Every other week, we examine the most pressing issues of the day through a historical lens, helping us understand what happened then and what that means for us now.
Welcome to Then and Now. I'm David Myers, host of the podcast. I'm delighted to welcome today a good friend, Katherine Fleming, who became on August 1st, 2022, the president and CEO of the J. Paul Getty Trust. This is a big job, which includes oversight of the Getty Foundation, the Getty Museum, the Getty Research Institute, and the Getty Conservation Institute. But Katie Fleming is used to big jobs. She came to the Getty from New York University, where she served as provost for 6 years, which, given the rigors of the job, should be counted really as dog years. Dr. Fleming is an award-winning historian of modern Greece who made a move relatively early in her career into academic administration. She has both a capacious historical vision and a good sense of how academic and cultural institutions work and have developed over the past few decades. In today's world, there are frequent assertions that the American university, as we know it, is dead, delivered to its burial by a combination of perennial underfunding, wokeness, and a global pandemic, among other factors. We hear again, since it is a recurrent phrase, of the death of the humanities, and many worry about the state of cultural institutions, museums, orchestras, theaters, with the passing of a generation. There's much anxiety out there. And so it is good to have Dr. Katherine Fleming with us, because she is wise, experienced, and calm, and she can help us make sense of the world out there. It's especially nice to welcome her back to LA, since earlier in her career, she was a lecturer at UCLA. Welcome to Then and Now, Katie Fleming.
Thanks so much, David. It's a pleasure to be talking with you.
Great. So you began your academic career, let's start at the beginning, with a certificate in theology from King's College London. And then you also continued to study religion as an undergraduate at Barnard. So I'm interested in, what was your interest at that time in the study of religion?
Well, I grew up in what non-academics would call a religious household, by which I mean my parents were and still are practicing Anglicans. My mother actually is an ordained Episcopal priest. And the Church of England, particularly its music and traditions, were a very big deal in our lives. And when I got to college, and I had even been aware of this in high school, I became acutely aware of the fact that I was among an increasingly small subset of people at secular American institutions who had sort of experienced religion, we could say, from the inside. But like most of them, I hadn't really thought about religion as a cultural product, as being no different from a work of music or a work of art or a language. And quite early in my time as an undergraduate at Barnard College in New York, I took a class. I have to admit, I took it simply because it fit into my schedule in comparative religion. And had one of those experiences that, you and I hope all our students have, of just thinking, wow, I have never thought about this kind of stuff before. I've never thought in these ways before. And I found it really compelling. And as a consequence of that, I became a religion major.
And has that interest in religion stayed with you, would you say? Is that at all a through line in your career in any meaningful way?
Certainly, although, religion over time has come to mean different things for me. I've become increasingly interested in religion as a category of difference and thinking about the ways in which that is or is not an appropriate way to think about it. I'm interested in what in a different age we would have called religious minorities. And another through line is that I'm really interested in language. So I've been attracted to the study of religions that have a strong textual tradition. And in learning the language, you can really sort of see continuities and ruptures more clearly than you can if you're reading things simply in translation. And that was something that was very, very significant for me as an undergraduate in terms of approaching New Testament literature and starting to have the ability to read it in the original Greek.
Right. And that relates to things that you would take on later in your career when you became an historian. And I'm interested in hearing how you sort of effected that transition from the study of religion to the study of history, although you've given us some ideas of how that occurred. But you would eventually become, when you completed your doctoral work, an historian of modern Greece. So how did, there is a common thread between the Greek of the New Testament and the Greece of modern times. How did that transition occur from ancient times, the study of religion, to history in the modern era?
So, I could come up with a fancy answer designed to make me sound as if I've had a coherent intellectual trajectory, or I could tell you the truth. And the truth is that if there's a through line, it's the same kind of randomness that led me to take that first course in comparative religion in my freshman year when, it was there. I needed the credits, and it turned out to be a good thing. And that is the case in terms of what you're asking about in two really significant ways. The first is that over the arc of my undergraduate experience, I took a fairly significant amount of time away from Barnard. I went to King's in the second half of my sophomore year and did an intensive study of the Greek in the epistles of St. Paul. And that was such an exhausting experience that it led me to drop out of college for a year. And on a complete whim, I accepted what I think was a sort of joking offer of employment at a tiny little restaurant in a tiny little village on the southwest coast of Crete. In an era, the mid-1980s, when you could still see the last of the old Greece. There was still a very pronounced rural tradition, no electricity, etc. And as a consequence of that, I learned really good Greek. I mean, you could debate whether it's really good Greek. I mean, it sounds sort of like, Appalachian English, a very heavily dialect version of Greek. But decided, now that I've learned this language that isn't all that easy to learn, why don't I do something with it? And that led me to move swiftly towards modernity and away from an earlier language form that was only written. And then the second way in which randomness pertains to this question is that the reason I moved from studying things in departments of religion, as I had done at both Barnard and the University of Chicago, to a department of history, which is what I landed up in at UC Berkeley, is that UC Berkeley doesn't have a department of religion. And I knew that I didn't want to continue my studies at the University of Chicago. They do something that they, and kind of only they, call the history of it has a very specific meaning to them, very precise meaning, heavily theorized. And while I started my doctoral studies there, I decided to go elsewhere, and for a variety of reasons ended up on the West Coast and was choosing actually for PhD programs between the history departments at UCLA and UC Berkeley and the program in religious studies at UC Santa Barbara, and I chose Berkeley.
And alongside the randomness of that invitation to make your way to that rural village on the southwest side of Crete, which at your recommendation I visited, what intrigued you about Greece? What was it about Greece that really captured your historical imagination?
It's very, very difficult to put one's finger on any one specific thing. The Mediterranean landscape is tremendously familiar to me. I, as a young child, had lived in the south of France for a significant period of time. And then as a somewhat less young child, had lived in Italy for a significant period of time. So it was the first real encounter I had with the Mediterranean as a kind of grown-up. And I remember feeling tremendously at home because of the light, the warmth, the stones. There was something that was very familiar to me about it that I'm sure connected to childhood moments that I hasn't even consciously been aware of as lurking within me. The town in which I was living is very close to what is at least held by tradition to be the first place visited by St. Paul when he set out on his missionizing journeys. If you get in a boat and head west for about an hour and a half from where I was, there is a small old Byzantine church built on the site. And it was really moving and really fascinating to me to be in a landscape about which I had read so much, and within which you could imagine the movement of historical figures of whom I had read.
And we could see the through line of your interest in religious minorities in your historical work. You have focused your attention on Greece. You've studied Muslims and Jews in Greece, and I'm wondering how that came about. How is it that you sort of didn't carry forward your interest in the origins of Christianity and focused your attention on Christians in Greece?
So I certainly have had an abiding interest in pivotal or interstitial or transitional moments. So when I was studying early Christian literature, I was super fascinated by the moment that there was sort of a battle over canonization and canonicity, and there were various versions of the Gospels floating around. This was at a time when Elaine Pagels had just, made this huge splash with her work, that these so-called Nag Hammadi Gospels, the Nag Hammadi texts, had finally been translated from Coptic into English. So I was really, really interested in this moment when people were sort of duking it out over what was going to count and what wasn't going to count, what was going to be accepted, what wasn't going to be accepted. And so that interest in, as I say, sort of transitional moments became grafted onto my historical interests as they pertain to the Ottoman Empire, in that I became really fascinated by both the 15th century and by the late 18th, early 19th centuries. And in the case of the 15th century, with the so-called fall of Constantinople, you have a really, really interesting concatenation of people on the scene. You have the Catholic West, who the Byzantine East has fallen out with, but to whom they're turning for assistance. You have the conquering Muslims on the scene. And it was very interesting to me to read. There are a lot of eyewitness accounts of 1453 available. And it was just very interesting to see the ways in which the traditions of those different groups became interwoven with one another, particularly around apocalyptic thought. There was a very strong strand of apocalyptic thought within Byzantine Christianity that regarded the fall of Constantinople to the Turks as being an act of divine intervention that was designed to protect them because they had been sort of cozying up to the Catholics. And I remember realizing, wow, it was worse to associate with Western Christianity than it was to associate with Islam. And then when I learned more about Jewish history, of course, I realized that this very strong apocalyptic thought that prevails in the 15th century is also a major feature of the Judaism of the period in the Mediterranean as well. And then kind of fast forwarding to the end of empire, for very different reasons, you similarly have weird alliances as the Greek Orthodox people, I'm not going to say church, as the Greek Orthodox people prepare for a revolution. You see all kinds of different players jockeying for position within a complicated landscape, and things don't fall out the way that you would imagine that they would, right? The official line of the church is, we're really happy under Ottoman rule. We don't want to have a revolution. You have people allying with different groups of Turks. You have, all kinds of things going on. So I became very interested in these liminal moments as moments that put together different groups of people in different ways. And I also found that really interesting because I think that the modern view of religious groupings in the Mediterranean, I say that as if everybody has a view on this. There are about 8 people in the world who care. I think imagines those categories as much less porous and much less likely to interact with one another in meaningful ways than I think historically was the case. And I found that interesting too.
I mean, you're not given to syrupy nostalgia, but I'm wondering, just in light of those comments, what you make today in retrospect of that Ottoman experiment in porous cultural, religious, and ethnic boundaries, and at the same time, a Millet system, which allowed for a large degree of religious communal autonomy. How does it seem to you today? There are many who look back to it with a kind of sentimentality and say, this kind of benign imperial regime there's a good mode of existence.
Right. Well, Erdogan is among them, and we want to be careful to, keep our distance from him. But things don't seem to be working out so brilliantly under our form of rule. I will make that observation. I think the Ottomans were kind of brilliant. They took a page out of the Roman book, but this idea of sort of like super stratification that you're going to come in, you're not going to mess around to any great extent with what's happening on the ground, so long as you can identify some people to whom you can deputize the job of keeping everything moving along smoothly, and then collect your tax revenue and, keep on expanding your borders. It's a much less exhausting form of imperial conquest than others out there. Obviously, not everybody did great under that system. And obviously, the nature of nationalism is such that it forces its peoples, the Greeks, the Serbs, whoever they are, to remember the Ottomans with great hatred. But yeah, I don't know that I have nostalgia for it, but I'm certainly not going to knock it as a form of rule. Let's put it that way.
I once had a colleague who memorably told me that his decades of research into Stalinism was the best preparation you could imagine for a career in university administration. And maybe you'll have an analogous thing to say about Ottomanism, but I do want to turn to that phase in your career. I mean, you're perhaps best known out there as the provost at NYU. And I'm wondering, was there a moment in your career as an historian at which you said, this research business is interesting and I like teaching, but I'm really interested in serving the wider community as an administrator? How did you go about that transition into university administration?
Well, again, a certain amount of just stumbling into things, as well as I do, that in a university context, there aren't a lot of people who like administration, much less who are, halfway decent at it. And if you are among them, you tend to get fairly swiftly rewarded with, one position after another. I think that was the case for me. I don't know what my first task was, whether it was directing the program in Hellenic Studies or European Studies or, whatever it was. I did something and did it well enough that when the then provost was seeking out what at the time were called provostial fellows, it was sort of like being a UN observer. You got to sit in on all the meetings, and some modest stipend, and you got to sort of observe things. But at the same time, they were sort of observing you, and that, led me ultimately to being appointed as a vice provost. I certainly appreciated the swifter pace of action that is, and, was possible in administrative life. The idea of convening an ad hoc committee that will, desultorily meet 4 times over the arc of the year and then possibly issue some non-binding recommendations, which will fade away over the summer, that doesn't strike me as the most exciting way to get things done. So certainly it appealed to my character and my general approach to things to find myself in a world where there was a little bit less of that, or at least I was the one convening the convening the ad hoc committee rather than having to participate in it. So, it isn't as if I decided one day, okay, this is what I'm doing, but I was good enough at it and found it appealing enough that I kept with it.
And now I'm going to ask you to step back and I guess put back on your historian's cap and discuss what your time as an administrator revealed to you about the American university, which many regard as riven, as lost, as broken. What do you think about where we're at in American higher education today?
So the first thing I have to say on this is that when people like you, David Myers, or Katie Fleming, when we talk about higher education, we're really talking about 30 to 40 institutions across the country. Just a kind of infinitesimally small subgroup of elitism within a huge world, a huge and variegated world of higher education out there across the United States, large portions of which are doing incredible things for social mobility and actually are delivering something resembling an education for a very reasonable cost. So, I'm happy to share my observations about that very small cluster of institutions, but, wouldn't want you or anyone else to think that that's what I think higher education in America is, right? It's just that we all are of the cast that those are the schools we went to and that we hope our kids will go to, and that our institutions, the institutions for which we work, are competing with or are aspiring to be. So there are immense pressures on higher education, particularly if you are at a place like UCLA or a place like NYU, although they're quite different, one being a state institution and the other being private. Both are institutions that have managed kind of incredibly to run with the big dogs for a really long time with a budgetary profile that is completely unlike that of the big dogs. And at this point, there's a handful of institutions like Princeton that, as far as I can make out, are effectively doing a favor to the rest of elite higher education by continuing to charge tuition. The endowment profile is such that revenue is not, quote, needed, or at least it's not needed in the same way that your institution or NYU needs the revenue. We all realized during COVID, we're like a coffee shop on the corner, right? If you stop selling your product and people stop paying for it, you're pretty swiftly going to be unable to cover the costs of remaining open as an institution. And there was a very small group that didn't have that same virtually existential threat hanging over them during COVID. And I would like to think that has made more visible to the public the really horrible financial reality that much of higher education is contending with. There always seems to be this notion, certainly amongst the faculty, that there's an imaginary pot of money somewhere that administrators could be spending if only they weren't so tight-fisted. And because that moment required a lot of financial transparency, I think maybe people came to understand this situation better. Now, I know there are a lot of dimensions to this beyond the financial, but I want to say one other thing on the financial dimension. All of these institutions, quite rightly, are committed to, or trying to be committed to, diversifying their student bodies as much as possible. Diversifying in all senses of the term, including economically diversifying them. the financial aid line in any university's budget is like any other. It's like an electric bill. It's like paying faculty salaries. It is part of the budget at these universities. So we're in this paradoxical, I don't know, I'm not going to call it a death spiral, but kind of endless upward spiral, in that paradoxically, the only way to bring in more money to pay for more financial aid is to increase tuition and make sure that you always have a certain number of people who are paying full tuition, right? If your tuition is $50,000 and you're trying to make it possible for very under-resourced to attend, discounting your tuition even by 50% to $25,000 isn't going to make that school accessible to them, right? Like, I'm not going to buy a $60,000 handbag when it's on sale for $35,000 because I'm just not the kind of person who's in the market for that product. So all you're going to do if you reduce tuition is effectively give a nice perk to people like us who, like, we can afford to pay the $50,000 tuition. Nice if you want to give it to me for $25,000, right? And then you're taking $25,000 incremental out of your budget that could be assigned to the financial aid line. So weirdly, I guess what that means is that American higher education, particularly the funding structure of American private higher education, is one of the only, like, almost explicitly regressive, like, progressive forms of taxation out there, right? Where it is understood that if you are wealthy, you're going to pay more than you're going to pay if you're not wealthy. And it's really interesting and kind of sad to me that the very people who are most outraged about the rising cost of higher education are the people who least understand that admittedly diabolical dynamic, but it is the only funding source that a lot of schools have for the very necessary economic diversification of their student bodies. And I wish that institutions felt more confident about being explicit about it, right? Like, I wish when a university sends out its letter saying this year's tuition increase is going to be 3%, that they would say, and we promise you, we pledge that every penny of that incremental 3% is going to go directly to fund financial aid. Because effectively that's what it's doing, but people aren't really saying it. People feel uncomfortable about it. People are worried, understandably, about not the people at the top, but the people in the middle who are still paying full freight and would be less comfortable with the idea that that's underwriting someone else's education. But that, for me, is probably the most vexing and ultimately threatening dynamic within the group of schools that you and I are talking about at the current moment, because we've locked ourselves into this world where the only thing you can do really is keep raising tuition, but at the same time, it's obvious that we can't possibly go on raising tuition.
Well, I mean, yes, it would be really interesting to play this out a bit further, but I also want to ask you about the cultural issues that vex that same group of schools. You know, the sense that the university is being undone by divisions that are reflected in larger American society and politics, as well as those that are very specific to the university. And I'm wondering what your experience was like in dealing with sort of the cultural issues that vex American universities today.
Yeah. You know, I think a lot of those cultural issues derive from another paradox, which is that universities are being called upon to solve so many problems that aren't ultimately of their making, although versions of the problems were manifest in the histories of these institutions, right? Exclusionary policies vis-a-vis minority groups, et cetera, et cetera. You know, historically, and certainly now, again, talking about the group of universities about which we're talking, universities have been among the most proactive institutions in society for bringing about greater equality, greater change, The professoriate has been getting steadily more and more liberal and more left-leaning, but by their own constituents, these institutions are treated as if they're kind of like reactionary hotbeds that, like, how dare you do this and how dare you do that? And I just think universities now have too many demands placed upon them. We're supposed to be intervening in a really significant way in the mental health crisis that we see all around us. We're supposed to be fixing social inequality at a time when the wealth gap has never been greater. We are supposed to be making up for and mending the hideous legacy of slavery and other, racial injustices. And I don't think it's appropriate for everybody to be leaning on universities to be one of the primary, if not the primary institutional form that is supposed to be addressing all that stuff and getting it right. So, yeah, there is a major social crisis. I think it reflects, obviously, the social crisis that we have all around us. But I feel as if it's been the university as a form is getting really, really heavily weighed down by it. And I think it's increasingly difficult for universities with a straight face to articulate their core mission as being education. Now, I'm from a generation that can't imagine a university having as its core mission something other than research and education. But I do think we're seeing emerging a line of thought, although it may not have crystallized as thought, the vibe, that really what we're supposed to be getting out of universities most significantly is something other than that.
And that is providing redress to social inequality in society?
Or, we're participating in it, that you are going to be, via your university experience, in a differing way, depending on which constituency of the university you're a part of, probably most potently if you're a student, but certainly there are other constituencies of the university too that are doing this, that your time at the university or your relationship with the institution and the way you live in that institution is your opportunity, or that your responsibility while there is to effect social change through that institution, and usually, frankly, by trying to change the institution itself.
Again, this is a line of discussion that could occupy us for many hours, but it does raise an interesting prospect, which is that faced with what would seem to be an impossible task, you, as a very astute observer, decided to exit that world and to make your way from a position of daily budgetary duress to a position of relative comfort as president and CEO of the J. Paul Getty Trust, which is known as being a extraordinarily well-endowed entity. And I'm wondering why. Was it in part being driven out of an impossible position as an administrator at a major university? Was it the allure of the J. Paul Getty Trust, a combination thereof? As our listeners will hear, you do not hesitate to be candid about life decisions of the world. So I'm curious to know, how did that come about?
Certainly a combination of things. I had decided in my own little noggin that I was going to step down from being provost in the summer of 23. So in about 4 months from now, I had decided that I was not going to pursue a university presidency. I had a couple little dalliances that didn't go anywhere at the places that might have interested me. And I sort of knew in my heart of hearts that that was not what I wanted to be doing. I felt exhausted. And frankly, I felt that most institutions deserved somebody who wasn't as exhausted and perhaps jaded as I was. It kind of felt like you're crawling across the finish line at a race, and then you're supposed to grab the baton again and start, running. And I just didn't really feel that was something that I was going to be able to do. And it wasn't going to be good for any institution if I tried to do it. I mean, there were a couple sentimental institutions at which I might have wanted to do it. So I knew I wanted to get out of the game. I thought I was going to cash in various leaves of absence and putter around. And my youngest kid was heading off to college, so I was going to finally have the ability to actually do something with my leaves of absence. And the position at the Getty Trust came completely out of left field in the form of a phone call from a search firm that I dismissed, several times over the course of several months. Told them, maybe if it were in a different place, or maybe if I were younger, maybe if I weren't so exhausted, whatever. And then ineluctably, it turned out that members of the search committee were out in New York City where I was living. Would I talk to them? Yes, I would talk to them. And then I learned a lot more about what the heck the J. Paul Getty Trust actually was. I think I, along with many people out there in the world, kind of thought the Getty is, quote, just a museum, or the Getty is, quote, just a foundation. Learned more about it and realized that it is actually a total powerhouse institution that has a lot of the features of at least a research-based academic institution, but a lot of other things as well. And it seemed to me that maybe I was, despite feeling very old, that I was perhaps too young to say, all right, I'm all done, and thought this would be a really great thing to try my hand at for a while.
So I enumerated 4 distinct pieces of trust, including the museum and the research institute. What is your job, actually?
Right. So those are the 4 programs. So the CEO of the trust is not supposed to be reduplicative of any of the programs, but really has their remit. And I think particularly in this instantiation, I think this was what I was hired to do, or at least what I was told that I was being hired to do, is kind of how to make the big overarching thing more than the sum of its parts, how to make a thing called the Getty more visible nationally and internationally, how to have a clearer strategic direction. You're right, the Getty is extraordinarily well endowed, and having a lot of money tends to make people a little less strategic. I mean, I can tell you in my old job, everyone was exhausted, but they were scrappy as hell, had a million ideas and constantly had to decide what not to do, as well as having to decide what to do. So the job, I think, is to help articulate an institution-wide strategy more crisply, make more legible the things that are going on, the great things that are going on within the 4 programs, and create a little bit more of a sense of there being one institution that has these 4 facets, but that nevertheless is one institution.
And what do you think the societal need or niche is that the Getty can meet?
The Getty is a philanthropic institution. It isn't simply the foundation that's philanthropic. Everything that the Getty does, it does for the outside world, it does, quote, for free. Whether it's helping other entities acquire works of art, restoring earthen architecture on other continents, whether it's financing archaeological digs in southern Iraq, it is all philanthropy. The Getty has no revenue source and doesn't aspire to have any revenue source other than its own endowment and returns on its endowment. And I think it is a remarkable thing that there is a cultural institution in the United States that can afford to function that way, right? It isn't constantly hustling to be able to, make payroll or raise enough money to do an exhibition that it wants to do. Instead, it's spending its money to help people around the world preserve their art, have better access to art, better understand their artistic traditions. And that's a really exceptional thing that I think is in great need.
So you mentioned the global audience that you hope to reach, that the Getty already reaches in many respects, but you want to expand. I'm also curious in knowing what role you see for Los Angeles in your vision of the Getty. This is, as I mentioned, a return of sorts for you personally. The Getty is an extremely significant LA-based institution at a time of tremendous transformation and growth in the city of LA. What's the LA piece of the story, and how does that fit into the larger global vision?
Right. So first of all, I think it's a false dichotomy, one that almost everybody subscribes to, is the idea that if you're thinking about LA, that it's at the expense of the international. And if you're thinking about the international, it's at the expense of LA. LA is a tremendously international city to begin with. And one of the things that makes the institution a powerhouse is that it makes it possible for local constituencies to be connected by art to a much bigger international stage. And it also makes it possible for the world to become much more aware of things going on in the art scene in Los Angeles. So I see those two things as absolutely mutually reinforcing, and any strategy that would be, quote, LA focused as sort of selling the people of LA short if it didn't include an international dimension. Just as I would view it as selling my job in LA short if I weren't constantly talking up LA in international contexts. I think it's just a statement of fact. There is an incredibly vibrant art scene in Los Angeles. I think one that has in many ways surpassed that of New York. And the Getty can really be important as a convener, as a place that people come to talk about really important issues. Perhaps the Getty can get away with hosting conversations that other institutions can't, precisely because we aren't worried about our donor base or worried about our bottom line. Getty has PST, Pacific Standard Time, an absolutely fabulous concept that really is designed to bring together and highlight museums and arts organizations across LA without Getty being the big dog, Getty being the entity that can bring everyone together. So I think the organization already is doing a lot in that realm. Should do more, should more visibly do more. And, there's an anxiety, which I find misplaced among some people, about the fact that the Getty is, up on a hill, far removed. Is that a metaphor for aloofness? But I can tell you there are thousands and thousands and thousands of people who come to it precisely because you get to go up on a hill and it's peaceful and beautiful, and you don't even have to go inside and look at a single work of art to enjoy it. You walk around the gardens, you see families doing it all the time, and it's a kind of incredible, magical experience of a sort that you wouldn't get otherwise. But that metaphoric take of it being aloof and distant gestures surely to something about which people have anxiety, and engagement with the city of Los Angeles should be designed to help ameliorate that.
Well, I have to say that those of us at UCLA look forward to seeing how the Getty will grow under your leadership, and we look forward to partnerships as we imagine sort of eviscerating that boundary between the local and the global that you spoke of. It's really been a great pleasure to speak with Dr. Katherine Fleming, President and CEO of the J. Paul Getty Trust. Best of luck in your endeavors, and we look forward to seeing you in Los Angeles.
Thanks so much, David. A pleasure.
Thank you for listening to Then and Now, a podcast by the UCLA Luskin Center for History and Policy. You can learn more about our work or share your thoughts with us at our website, luskincenter.history.ucla.edu. Our show is produced by David Myers and Rosalind Campbell, with original music by Daniel Reichman. Special thanks to the UCLA History Department for its support, and thanks to you for listening.